And so we have to start thinking about, innovation. Innovation in both disruption and prevention. So one of the things we did at Microsoft is we looked at a particular botnet that was responsible for a lot of nefarious activity. This botnet was the top 10 botnet in 39 countries. Hotmail alone blocked over 650 million connections from infected computers. The malicious software removal tool that we run as part of automatic update cleaned almost 100,000 infected machines. So knowing that we had this problem, it was an opportunity to innovate about both disruption and to start thinking about innovating about prevention. So how did we think about disruption? Well, one of the things we did is we turned to the courts. As I said, we always have to align not just social, political, economic, and IT forces, but we need to use social mechanisms and political mechanisms to reinforce values. If you think this behavior is wrong, then society should do something about it in a structured way. So one of the things we did is we used the court process. We went and did a court filing. It was supported by industry partners in academia. We got temporary orders to sever the domains. We notified the people whose domains were affected. We waited 14 days, and then we could terminate basically the head of the botnet. Now, it's an interesting idea. It's something that we will continue to pursue as appropriate. I don't mean to suggest this is a remedy for the botnet problem. It isn't. The point is that just like we do defense in depth in IT, we have to do defense in depth in response. We have to think about technical solutions such as cleaning machines, and we need to think about social solutions like using the courts and getting people involved. So to me, of course, this was an interesting way to proceed. But it also raises an obvious question. This is reactive. What do we do proactively to change the problem? So we've started to think about this. I actually think that the healthcare model, particularly related to the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control, and other countries have similar organizations and authorities, might be an interesting way to think about the problem. With medical diseases, we basically educate people, and sometimes if you've flown to certain countries, they'll scan you for your temperature, you get off the plane. If you seem to be infected, you're quarantined and you're treated. The question is, why don't we do this for consumers? Why don't we think about access providers who are doing inspection and quarantine and cleaning machines prior to access to the internet? And the reason this becomes so important is if you look back at the end-to-end trust paper, which was actually written a couple of years ago, there's a line in it that says, who's the CIO for the public sector? The reason governments and enterprises can manage the botnet risk is because they have professional IT staff. This is their job. They manage this risk. It is much more complicated in the consumer space. I mean, one of the things I love to do is just look at my own life. And one of the things I've done is, I have 3 children and I have my mother, who's fortunately still healthy. And so I'm one of the sandwich generation. I've got the mom and I've got the kids. And every now and then I juxtapose my 4.5-year-old with my 80-year-old mother. In part because they behave so much alike. It just astounds me. But let me tell you one way they also behave alike. My 4.5-year-old has learned to navigate with a mouse. And it's just great to watch. He navigates to the mouse. Up pops his security dialogue. He can't read. He doesn't understand it. He clicks OK. Then I go to my mom. She's got a PhD in education. She gets the dialog box. She can read. She doesn't understand it. And she clicks OK. OK? We can't do it that way anymore. The attacks are happening at light speed. We have to respond at light speed. So we should think about inspection and quarantine. Now, there are some obvious questions. Why should we be doing this to people? Will people accept it socially and politically? Well, we've done it with smoking. People used to smoke, and we said, look, you're going to kill yourself, but if you want to die, go ahead. You're causing costs to the healthcare system. We'll eat those costs. Go ahead and kill yourself. Then, of course, the EPA comes out with secondhand smoke. Suddenly, smoking's banned everywhere. You have a right to infect and give yourself illness. You don't have the right to infect your neighbor. Well, the computers are the same way. We've told people, run antivirus, patch, back up your data. But if you don't do that stuff and you lose all your stuff, that's a risk you can accept. But today, you're not just accepting it for yourself. You're contaminating everyone around you, right? And we do this in other areas like vaccinations. If you have kids who go to public schools, they get vaccinated or they don't go. We do those kinds of enforcement. And then there's a question of who would pay for that. Well, maybe markets will make it work, but if not, there are other models. Use taxes for those who use the internet. We pay a fee to put phone service in rural areas. We pay a tax on our airline ticket for security. You could say it's a public safety issue and do it with general taxation. And there's also a good role for government here. If access providers are going to scan for content, what content can they scan for? If you want to protect networks, then you have to limit the activity to network protecting activity, not worry about copyrighted material or speech or other kinds of things. But we do have to innovate, and this example gives you another reason to constantly think about alignment. How would you get social acceptance, political acceptance, find the right economic model, and have IT, which does do, of course, things like NAP and NAC today. How do we use IT to achieve these objectives? So we have some interesting opportunities here. Now let me talk about the cloud, because the cloud is the big thing. First of all, let me make sure we're talking about the same thing. You know, the National Institute of Standards and Technology has done a great deal in talking about cloud definitions. There's infrastructure where you just rent the hardware. There's the platform where you get the operating system. Microsoft has Azure that's on the platform. And then there's the total outsource model, infrastructure, operating platform, and applications, right? And there'll be different kinds of clouds. There'll be public clouds, private clouds, hybrid clouds. To be clear, these models are not completely new. People have outsourced in the past and put their data with third parties. Consumers are used to things like Hotmail, which is just software as a service. But what is different about this cloud, what makes this different, is a couple of attributes. There will be some new platforms, like the operating system for the cloud, that dynamically allocates resources. There will be global elasticity. You will be able to park data in various places all over the world on the fly, and you might not even know where your data is, and there's co-tenancy. Art talked about, you know, Coke and Pepsi wouldn't want to share the same hardware, but there will be co-tenants in the cloud. And as a result of that, that creates a bunch of implications for those of us in the security and privacy space. The first has to do with the shifting shared accountabilities. So in the box product world, we develop a product, we give it to you, and then you go out and you configure it and patch it and do that management work. Depending on which cloud model you use, you take on more or less responsibility in the cloud. And there'll be challenges for compliance, because the fact that your data is in the compliance in the cloud doesn't mean you don't have compliance obligations. Moving all the data together in the cloud can create rich targets for bad guys to go after. And there'll be the question of how you do shared investigations. I'll talk more about this in a minute. There'll be a lot of information aggregation in the cloud and questions about what the cloud provider can do with that information. And there'll be questions about jurisdiction, which I'll talk about too. So if we think about the cloud implications, then I can start to think about the end-to-end trust vision and how it's impacted by the cloud. First, it's more important than ever that we do the fundamentals right and that your cloud provider do the fundamentals right. Because you're increasingly going to be relying on that third party. If you're using a platform, was that platform developed with a security development lifecycle in mind? Can you ensure that the cloud provider is using the same rigor that you would use? Is one of the things to think about. We have to think about privacy-centric models. So how does the cloud provider, what rights, if any, do they reserve to use your data? And how are they going to respond to threats in the cloud? The trusted stack becomes important, as Art talked about. We need to root the trust in hardware, but it's going to be virtualization that is the key to keeping the tenants separate. So how are we going to make sure those virtualized compartments are secure as we move up the stack from the hardware? Audit is going to increase in importance as we try and figure out what happened to the data. And how are we going to do forensics investigations in the cloud? You know, not long ago, there was a hospital that got contacted by a bad guy who said they had stolen data, and if they weren't paid money, they would release the data. And they shared some of that data to show there was really a compromise. Suppose that data had been in the cloud. The hospital calls the cloud provider and says, we think you lost a data